Hello and welcome to AEF TV in association with Engerati. I am joined now by Stephen from the African Legal Support Facility, or ALSF for short, probably easier to say. Stephen, firstly, welcome.
Thank you very much, Adam.
We were talking a little bit off air, and just to get straight into the story, what are the sort of energy gaps that you're seeing within the African context, anyway?
I think the narrative has been given. We usually hear of a big number of the population in Africa without electricity. Numbers are floated around 600 to 700 million. But there is a bigger story in terms of affordability. The fact that the cost is so high that industrial development in Africa is severely affected by that. We will not be able to get industrial development unless industry has an affordable price for the energy access, apart from the lack of availability for the rural populations.
And do you think that within that context, again, there's obviously at a forum like this, there's a lot of talk about, big industrial scale investment, big power plants and so on. But there's also underneath that another conversation, which is about how we could accelerate access to power. And it's already happening where people are bypassing the governmental institutions. Communities are going direct to developers and working out how we can build a rural microgrid. Industry is going direct to technology providers, and that's not just an African trend, it's also happening in developed countries. We see it with big retail chains like Walmart and stuff like that, de-risking their energy supply. Do you think that is an area that should be looked at much more aggressively and much more further? Can that accelerate the availability of power?
I don't think we have any alternative, because when you talk of the gaps are in all the three areas: generation, transmission, and distribution. And the problem with the rural areas is they have no access because the gaps in transmission are widespread and the cost is too high for most of the government.
Yeah, so there's a cost for putting the transmission line doesn't
So probably those innovative ways of giving access to the rural areas on small unit kind of generation plants for just those particular areas is the way forward. And that is already happening in some countries.
Do you think there's enough focus on that innovation piece? Do you think there's enough, because one of the other things that some of the finance people who are sat in this chair are saying, well, it takes us as much to invest in a small project as it does in a big project, so guess where they're going to go. But do we need to look at more innovative financing of these smaller projects to put them together as maybe portfolios?
Unfortunately, the reality is you are right. There's not enough focus because of the high cost and the return on that being low. But if we really want sustainable development, if we want development to get to the rural areas, we have to find a way in which the governments can subsidize that additional supply using that an innovative approach.
Okay. And so moving this story on a little bit, and it was some of the interviews certainly last year and some of the ones this year touched on it again. And it's a continual thing about having regional integration. You've got states who are rich in hydro capacity, for example, cooperating with other states. We've got the big example about Inga powering South Africa and things like that. If you were to give us a view about where that regional integration conversation is at the moment, what would you say?
You will be surprised. The regional discussion and regional installation is very advanced. In West Africa, we have the West African Power Pool, and they've been trying to create transmission lines across the whole region. In Southern Africa, we have the Southern African Power Pool. That INGA arrangement proposal is based on the pooling of the resources together on the Southern African basis. The same you have in the East African Power Pool arrangement for the Eastern African region. The discussion is so much advanced. I have actually in the past worked on having a linkage between the Southern African Power Pool and the East African Power Pool through the Tanzania, Zambia, Kenya transmission network. So that is, the plans for that are already underway. An authority has been established. That is important because it's not just one sub-region, but is also trading power across the sub-region. And that, for the southern and eastern region, is so interesting because when you have excess in the Eastern African region, the surplus in the East African, you have a deficit in the Southern African region, especially where you are using hydro because the rainfall patterns are different. So those arrangements are very much advanced, and I think that's the way forward to go. And especially for the small countries, they don't really need to invest in huge installations. They can access those power pools, and I think it would be
so when you talk about the power pools, let me ask you the question of like, how real are they from an infrastructure perspective, or are we? Is it still a negotiation phase? I mean, you know, where are the gaps? You know, where's ground been broken?
No, they are very advanced. For instance, in the Southern African power pool, they can trade and move electricity across the whole region in a very short time of space. They have very specific arrangements. The East African region is almost getting to that. The West African region is already also at that level. So what is missing is having sufficient generation capacity for trading across the region.
So actually the framework's in place, and it's the generation that's missing in terms of you being able to balance everything out. Yeah. So again, you know, we're kind of building a nice roadmap of the power issues within Africa. So let's go to the place where, unfortunately, there's still some countries in Africa which are termed as, and you can correct me here, states in a fragile state. Is it
situation?
Is a fragile situation. Okay. Yeah. So that's the term. We all know what that means. So how do you get power in you know, through some of the work you guys are doing? How do we get power into states like that? Because the state situation is very different to my personal situation on the ground. I still need power.
For many of these states, you actually find they have huge deficit in electricity generation, and therefore nothing can take place. You cannot improve social services without that. There is only one solution for them usually: emergency power supply in the short run. In the medium term, they should be looking at the renewables. But even for that, the prices still remain high. But I would say that for the renewables, the prices are probably more attractive than the thermal emergency power plants they use, which then attract a huge debt on their balance sheets, which is unfair.
But isn't the emergency power supply also inherently expensive?
Very expensive. I would say that if it were possible and we are able to support them on a very subsidized rate, because they need that power to get off from the crises that they have. And that's where the international community comes in. That's an area for those kind of countries that should be supported for them
So that comes into a financial support that has a more philanthropic element to it and everything. So let's move on from that conversation to a fact that, you know, which has always been one of those issues, you know, not just in Africa, but in all developing areas where you have that sort of more philanthropic led approach. How do you make that sustainable? You know, how do you, you know, put in that seed investment, for want of a better word, and it then helps accelerate a more sustainable growth?
Well, there are many ways of doing that. Our role as the facility is to help those countries negotiate deals that are more sustainable. In most cases, they are approached by private sector investors whose primary aim is a huge profit, and they sign on to those deals without looking at the long-term, their long-term.
So that's where an organization like yours comes into.
That's where we come in, because we provide a rapid response support to negotiate. We give them best case examples and also point them to issues that they need to attend to. Put the necessary frameworks in place, put the regulatory regimes in place to enable them attract that investment, advise them on having a competitive process, you could make a huge difference of between 15 cents per kilowatt hour and 50 cents per kilowatt hour and save many of these countries from a disaster down the road.
So that sounds like, again, I'm going to put a human element into it. You know, people want things quickly. What you've described sounds complicated. Sounds like it's going to slow the process down. But have you come to a place through, you know, it's not the first time you're doing it, and so on. Have you come to a place where actually you can put in all this best practice and not slow down the delivery process?
Unfortunately, that is difficult, but slow down is comparative. Slow down 2 or 3 months is reasonable.
Yes.
But slow down 1 year, 2 years, then that becomes unreasonable because you have desperation and they end up taking a more expensive arrangement.
So
which is
you
costly.
actually recognize that
We
as
do
an issue?
recognize, But when you're talking about infrastructure, slow down is comparative. A short period, 3-4 months, which I think we are able to provide, empowers the country more and probably enables them to get a better deal.
And just as we're coming to the end of our time here in the studio, we are at AEF, so you know, get some recognition to that. Can I ask you, what are there any sort of conversations and sort of talks you've heard that give you a sense of encouragement, and maybe even on the flip side, you know, are there conversations and talks you've heard where you're like, I can't believe we're still talking about this, you know? I'll let you use your own words.
I think I always try to focus on the positive, and I've had more conversations that are encouraging. And I think the key conversation is that there are many investors out there, so there is room for competition. So that gives me the information to advise the countries whenever they want to conclude deals quickly, that why don't you try and see which other suppliers are on the market. And then there is encouragement that the governments, African governments, know that they have to invest in better regulatory regimes. The regulatory authorities are probably more informed. On the flip side, of course, is what I already know. Capacity is always lacking, and where you have a flip side like that, there's room for building that, and that's where we come in. Building capacity for the governments to be able to negotiate these deals better and to know where available suppliers are.
And do you think, you know, a lot of the financiers have said, okay, we want transparency and a good regulatory regime and so on. And, you know, do you think with organizations such as yours, you know, are the investors and the power providers sort of welcoming your involvement, or do they resist it, or you know, because you mentioned it earlier, right? Let's face it, you know, these are commercial companies; they're in it for a profit. You know, some more ethical than others.
That's true.
But are you seeing a general trend towards the welcoming of, you know, your organization and others here as part of the mix? Does it give them more confidence?
For the majority of the investors, suppliers, it gives them much, much more confidence, because these deals are long-term deals, 15, 20 years. It is in their interest to conclude a balanced deal, which is more sustainable than a deal which is not balanced. So for the genuine investors and suppliers, they certainly welcome this, and they know that the countries take that in stride and know that they would be negotiating on an even scale rather than negotiating something that they don't know the long-term interest. So they definitely welcome our support to these countries in the negotiating process.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Stephen. And unfortunately, that's all we've got time for. Thank you as well for watching. This has been another interview for AEF TV in association with Engerati. Thanks again.
Thank you very much, Alan.